Hallie are on the ground with tornadoes ripping through the South. 3 people dead, including an 11-year-old boy. Hundreds of people without power. Millions more still in the path of dangerous storms tonight. We'll take you live to North Texas, where the mayor is giving a message of hope. Also new tonight, the family of a black man killed by police is suing the officers who shot him. And city officials in Ohio, $1 million for each bullet. What we're hearing from Jalen Walker's relatives tonight. Then in tonight's Newsmaker, we go one-on-one live with Miami's mayor on why he's getting into the Republican race for the White House and what else he might consider. Plus, an NBC News exclusive, the country's biggest group of pediatricians sounding the alarm about those popular weighted sleep sacks for babies, what they want new parents to know. And The Flash bolts into the theaters with a swirl of controversy around the movie's star. How the studio is responding as the first box office numbers from one of its big summer blockbusters start to roll in. That's coming up later on in the show. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and we're coming on the air with breaking news. Millions of people in the South at risk of dangerous weather after a day of deadly storms, killing 5 people, 3 in North Texas after a tornado ripped through town. Look at this. You can see it flying in here. Debris in the air. It is swirling around. It left this behind. Take a look. A mobile home community taking a direct hit. Homes and cars just destroyed. Just piles of stuff, wood, people's homes, their lives. That's what it looks like now. As we're learning tonight more about the people killed, including Matthew Ramirez, just 11 years old. He died while in his family's trailer. Becky Randall, who's in her 60s, was working at a print shop when the tornado hit. Her daughter-in-law describing her as a living angel on earth. Cindy Brascover was also killed, also in her 60s. She was at a local food bank. And then there's this moment. The fire chief, who's an Army veteran, stops. Look at this, reaches down, pulls out an American flag from underneath all that fallen wood, holding it up as a symbol, with the mayor of Perryton giving this message of hope. Listen.
The people of the Texas Panhandle are tough people. They're very resilient. They'll rebuild, and this town will be better than ever.
It's not just Texas. You've got Florida reeling after a twister blasted the Pensacola area, killing 1 person after a tree fell on their home. You can see how rainy it was, what the storms look like. Now, across the South, you have nearly 500,000 people without power. Of those people, about 1/3 of them are in Texas. Meteorologist Bill Cairns is standing by with the latest on where the storms are headed next. But I want to get to Priscilla Thompson, who is live in Perryton, Texas, that town that was just so hard hit. Priscilla, tell us more.
Yeah, Hallie, I just spoke to the sheriff, who estimates around 100 homes and 8 to 10 businesses destroyed, and looking like this one here with the walls just completely collapsed in. You see that they've already got the heavy machinery out trying to clear this devastation out. And I want to show you one other thing over here. It is a cell tower that actually fell down on top of a home. They were able to move it off of the road, but this is sort of a reflection of the strength of this tornado that touched down. And I spoke to one man, Victor Munoz, who was at home with his little brothers. He said that all of a sudden they see this tornado out of the window. They had no time to even get into the basement. They just ran into the bathroom and hid there. And I talked to him about what it has been like today as he's trying to clean up his home. And I want to play a little bit of what he shared with me.
He told them we don't have a house anymore. Like, told them that don't matter. It could all be replaced. It's just as long as you're okay, we're okay. That's all that matters. It sucks seeing my house like this. We moved in 2012, and we had all these memories, and just seeing the house like this, it's really devastating and everything.
Lots of devastation, but of course, people grateful to be alive. There were those 3 people that were killed. The sheriff also said he believes there were 135 people who have been treated in hospitals. No update on the conditions of some of those folks who were in critical condition earlier today, but still folks beginning to clean up and think about picking up the pieces here.
I mean, we are seeing the cleanup behind you, Priscilla, the literal picking up of the pieces, right? As you have that construction equipment in, people trying to think about beginning to rebuild. And now tonight we're learning more about questions of whether or not there was enough warning about these tornadoes coming through.
Yes. So when I spoke to Victor, he said he did not hear a siren. He had gotten a warning earlier in the day saying it would happen between a couple of certain hours, but never heard a siren. And I asked the sheriff about that, and he told me that by the time the tornado bore down, it bore down so quickly that they had already lost power. They weren't able to sound the sirens. And the really sad thing about that is that this is a community that has a storm shelter, and we know that those shelters save lives, but people were not even able to get to that shelter because of how quickly all of this happened. It was basically on top of them by the time they knew it. And so certainly very concerning. And the other thing that the sheriff told me is that he does not think that there's been enough damage for FEMA to come in. And one of the things that I talked to Victor about was how he was going to fix his home. And he said he didn't know. He was hoping that there would be FEMA aid and federal aid. And it does not appear that that's going to happen here because his family, like many others here, don't have insurance.
To be clear, Priscilla, did people get any kind of warning on their phones, whatever, before the power went out as this thing was bearing down?
So they got a warning. From what Victor told me, he got a warning on his phone. And, you know, you get those warnings that say there's a warning in effect from 4 to 6 p.m. or something like that. But he didn't get the siren saying it's here, you need to take cover. And that's really what's important.
Priscilla Thompson, thank you so much for being there and for your reporting on the ground. Let me bring in Bill Cairns here. So we know where the twisters have hit. Where are the storms headed next, right? Where's the biggest threat now?
Yeah, and I can answer that question that you just asked Priscilla, too.
Please.
So everything that I've seen said that the tornado warning for Perryton went out 4 minutes before the tornado struck. And the tornado almost developed, over the top of the city and just east of there. So there wasn't a lot of warning for like, hey, there's a tornado coming, get to your shelter. Still with 4 minutes, you'd expect that everyone would have gotten alerts on their phones. And if there are tornado sirens in that town, they would have been going off, 3 minutes ahead of time. So, but, obviously they'll look into that and research that just to get confirmation on all that. So, Hallie, new information that just came in about 7 minutes ago. Public spotted a tornado just east of downtown Norfolk and Crittenden. And so we have a possible tornado on the ground with this storm here. So this is a severe thunderstorm watch. It's not a tornado watch, which means conditions aren't favorable for tornadoes, but it doesn't mean you can't get an isolated one. We've also got a couple storms just south of the D.C. of the Beltway, one near Fredericksburg. We've had a lot of storms in between Richmond and Roanoke Rapids. But let's go in a little closer on this storm here. We have that tornado warning that has been issued heading from Newport News into right over the top of Old Dominion University and into areas of the northern half of the city of Norfolk. And that's with this storm coming through in the next half hour. It has already produced a tornado. We don't know if it was big or small. All we got confirmation from the Weather Service was that the public said, we see a tornado. They issued the tornado warning. So definitely the sirens are going off in the Norfolk area. Everyone's heading to their shelters as that goes through. Later tonight, we'll watch the south all the way to Little Rock to the Mobile and Pensacola, and then we'll also be watching areas in Colorado, isolated severe storms. And Hallie, we're not done. Tomorrow, another severe weather outbreak possible from Oklahoma City towards Dallas, so right through the holiday weekend.
People can't catch a break in that part of the country. Bill Cairns, thank you very much for that. To Pittsburgh now, where you are about to see the moment that the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter learned he could face the death penalty as it's laid out in court sketches. There it is, with the jury finding him guilty of carrying out the deadliest attack on Jewish Americans in this country's history. This shooter is now convicted on all 63 charges, including nearly a dozen hate crimes related to the murders of the worshipers that you see here: Jerry Rabinowitz, Rose Mallinger, David and Cecil Rosenthal, Richard Gottfried, Joyce Feinberg, Melvin Wax, Daniel Stein, Bernie and Sylvan Simon, and Irving Younger. We're getting the first reaction now to this conviction from the Tree of Life Synagogue, whose CEO says to the families of the victims that while this verdict cannot bring back their loved ones, she hopes it can provide some level of comfort and help ease the pain. Stephanie Gosk joins us now. It's been 5 years since the shooting, and yet in court, what we've seen this week, today, gut-wrenching emotion for these people. It's like it happened just yesterday.
Yeah, and, you have to also consider the fact that, one of the sad parts of these mass shootings is that they often don't go to trial because the shooter is killed in the incident. And that's not the case here. Right. And so what these people have been living through is really a step-by-step retelling of what happened on that horrific day. When they read this verdict, all 63 counts, you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. Wow. And then as they went on, you could start to hear some sobbing. People crying that this trial was over. Think about some of the testimony that they heard. They heard 911 calls, including, you know about this couple that was shot and killed. They had gotten married in that same synagogue 62 years before. They were shot and killed. The wife was on the phone with 911, when she was shot. That was played during this trial. You had a woman who took the stand, who survived, who had her arm nearly shot off, describing what that was like to have that happen. She sat next to her mother as her mother died. Incredibly traumatic moments. And we heard today from the rabbi from the synagogue, and he said what you could probably imagine. It's Friday, it's Shabbat. This would be a night of prayers. And he said, in the face of the horror of our community has experienced, I can think of no better response than practicing my Jewish faith and leading worship tonight.
This trial is only the second federal death penalty trial in the Biden administration, and the sentencing phase will start at what point, Steph? Walk through the timeline here, because that's another
right
another
away.
Step in this.
Yeah, pretty much right away. Well, actually, the end of the month. I think June 28th is the date. It's going to be the same jury. And really what the defense was working on, because they did not
present anything.
They didn't argue against any of these facts. Not really. What they were arguing was the motive. And they're going to come in and they're going to talk about how the fact that he was detached from reality, that he was irrational and suffered from mental illness. So the jury will hear that. And then you will have the prosecutors who will push for the death penalty. It could last 6 weeks, and then they will decide whether he will face the death penalty for this.
Stephanie Goss, thank you so much for bringing us that reporting from
You're
Pittsburgh.
welcome.
Appreciate it. The family of an unarmed black man who was shot dozens of times and killed by police in Ohio is now filing a huge federal lawsuit tonight, saying these officers used excessive force, describing a culture of violence and racism inside that city's PD. This is a lawsuit filed by Jayland Walker's family, demanding $45 million in damage. That's $1 million for every bullet that hit Walker in this confrontation with police about a year ago. We've been following this case. Remember, police released body cam footage last year that showed officers chasing Walker through the streets of Akron in a car and on foot before firing at him more than 90 times. We're showing the lead up to that moment here. The lawsuit comes after an Ohio grand jury back in April did not indict the officers involved. That led to some big protests in Ohio and around the country. NBC's Maggie Vespa is covering this story for us. Tell us more about the lawsuit and what it says about police.
Yeah, Hallie, as you said, this is a massive lawsuit. We have kind of the bullet points of the main points of it. It's a $45 million lawsuit in federal court just filed this week in Ohio. The defendants named in this lawsuit are the 8 officers involved in that shooting, who we should note a grand jury declined to indict on criminal charges. So now we're in the civil realm. Also, Akron's mayor and chief of police. And it alleges excessive force in the shooting with Walker, but also kind of a deeper seated, broader culture of violence and of racism in the Akron Police Department. Here's part of that press conference earlier today.
It is not Jayland Walker who has been the menace in this case. It's been the city's police department and its culture of violence and hate.
Now, one piece of evidence that's making a lot of news that the attorneys for Jayland Walker's family offered today was actually a 1998 internal city memo written by a then police officer in Akron PD, now a retired captain, detailing a shift back in '98, basically in a predominantly black neighborhood. And he meant it to be a satirical memo in which he describes black people in that neighborhood as species and as animals. It is frankly horrifically racist, and he was disciplined at the time, but he was not fired, which is, lawyers say, evidence of this kind of deeper-seated culture of racism. Hallie, I want to note really quick, I talked to him on the phone a few minutes ago. He says he is embarrassed and he's blown away that this is, in his words, being drudged up 25 years later. He says, again, he was suspended. He was disciplined. He went through sensitivity training after that. He regrets it immensely, but he says he does not believe there is a culture of racism in that police department. He's the only one commenting, by the way.
I was just going to ask.
The police department, the chief, the city, all not commenting.
This decision, you mentioned that grand jury declined to indict in this instance. You've got Walker's family, Walker supporters hoping for accountability here. They have this lawsuit filed today. Is that in some ways the end of the road for them? In other words, are there any other avenues for accountability for them other than this?
Yeah, like, is that it at this point? Essentially, they hope not. Activists and the families have been asking for a federal probe, potentially by the DOJ. They actually brought up today the George Floyd case and the findings from that, hoping essentially for something similar. And they're headed to D.C. on the 27th to hold a rally demanding exactly that. At the same time, you're seeing cultural shifts a little bit in Akron PD. The chief this week announced a new policy tied to police chases, high-speed chases, basically limiting when officers can and should give chase. And they also announced this new program with co-responders, like mental health professionals who will go with police on certain calls when it might be beneficial. But the Walker family attorney noted the family would love to be part of these conversations that are putting together these new policies. But he said at this point, the family is not part of these conversations, and they're still, in their minds, just fighting for justice for Jalen. Hallie.
Maggie Vespa, thank you very much for that. Sometime in the next few hours, we will see Secretary of State Tony Blinken heading off to China, the first ever trip there by a Biden cabinet member, and the first time any Secretary of State has gone there since 2018. It's a kind of do-over after a visit planned for February was derailed by, well, by this, right? That Chinese spy balloon caught flying over the U.S., over sensitive military sites. I know you remember what happened, that shoot down, the tensions ratcheting up. All of it happening now as NBC is reporting exclusively about President Biden wanting to call the Chinese president after the whole balloon thing, but he was talked out of it, apparently by aides, according to sources talking with our team. There is a lot here, right? Everything from the balloon to Taiwan to trade, human rights, the war in Ukraine, the just generally testy mood between the two countries in the South China Sea. NBC's Mike Memley is covering this for us. And, Mike, it's not often that, you know, one of the biggest stories in national news is going to be a Secretary Blinken trip to China. This is a significant moment as it relates to sort of the world order, the geopolitics here.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S.-China relationship, it's big, it's complicated. There's been significant tensions of late. And we just a couple weeks ago heard President Biden acknowledge that over what he called that silly spy balloon issue. But he did say at the time that he did expect a thaw in the relationship. But when you look at what we're hearing from both sides at this point, even ahead of the visit, it's pretty clear that the U.S. seems maybe more interested in that thaw than the Chinese side. I want to compare what we see in terms of the readouts we got from the State Department and from the Chinese government about a call that Secretary Blinken made to his counterpart ahead of this visit. You see on the U.S. side, they discussed the importance of maintaining open lines of communication and responsibly manage this relationship. On the Chinese side, they refer to the U.S. interfering in China's internal affairs, really speaking to what they feel is a provocative set of actions on the part of the Biden administration of late, whether it's on trade or, of course, that spy balloon. But you really do have to go back to that moment to explain this, because this is a relationship the U.S. says that needs to be about competition, not conflict.
That's right.
These relationships are about, especially to the Chinese side, the symbolism. And when Blinken canceled that visit after the spy balloon, that was really a slap to the Chinese, and they're making us really come back a little bit more apologetically at this point, let's say.
Can you deliverables is a word that people here, people where you are in Washington often like to talk about, right? What are the deliverables? What do we get out of this? What's the goal? What's the end game for this trip? Like, in other words, when Secretary Blinken gets back to the U.S., what will a win for this visit look like?
Well, a real win, and this is one of the things we're all going to be looking for, is whether Secretary Blinken, who officially is going to be meeting with his counterpart with other Chinese officials, does ultimately sit down with President Xi. And we know the way this all works, that the way the Chinese like to see this, and this gets to the reporting from our team about what President Biden wanted to do just a few days after that balloon was shot down, speak directly to President Xi. The Chinese protocol is to have a series of engagements at lower levels, slowly escalating until you get to that principal level, the president-to-president conversation. But the way President Biden looks at this is, hey, I've been talking to President Xi since we were both vice presidents 12 years ago when he made that first trip to Beijing for that very first meeting between a U.S. official and then Vice President Xi. So he thought he has this relationship and he can call him directly, and that might diffuse some of those tensions after that balloon was shot down. But according to our team's reporting, the White House did talk him out of that, saying it's much more important to have these lower level conversations at first. Now, the White House is denying this. We see this in a statement from a National Security Council official. It was echoed today by the White House Deputy Press Secretary, who said emphatically that this was not something that the president had to be talked out of. But it is clear in our reporting that, backed up by some officials, albeit anonymously, that this was something that did take place. And it speaks to what President Biden likes to see as the power of personal diplomacy going up against the very hierarchical and protocol-based Chinese diplomacy at this stage.
Mike Memley, thank you very much. Appreciate that. To an NBC News exclusive now, our team sitting down with the widow of Jamal Khashoggi, the U.S. journalist, of course, who American intelligence officials say was brutally killed by the Saudis. She is now launching a new lawsuit against an Israeli spyware company. She says they spied on her husband before he was murdered and are complicit in his death. Watch.
What did that feel like to you when you realized that your phone was an open book for your husband's worst enemies?
I feel very sore. I feel very sore, but I don't have a guilt because I did try as much as I can to save Jamal. I feel sore they misuse me.
A spokesperson for the company tells the Washington Post they did not receive a copy of the lawsuit and would respond, I'm quoting here, in the relevant channels. You just saw CNBC's Eamon Javers having that conversation. He joins us now. Eamon, we're so glad to have you to talk to us more about this. This is a moment when the Saudis are in the spotlight for a lot of different reasons, even as it relates to, for example, that golf tournament, the Live Golf tournament they backed that they've now merged with the PGA Tour. Tell us more about this conversation, how that came up, and the dynamic that Jamal Khashoggi's widow sees here.
Well, Hallie, thanks. So the conversation came up because she filed this lawsuit against NSO Group yesterday. NSO Group is an Israeli-based spy firm that has a software program called Pegasus, which was absolutely cutting-edge software that could break into iPhones and Android devices around the world with zero click. You know, you hear a lot about spyware coming into your phone if you click on a link and you sort of dumbly agree to let it in. Well, this gets into your phone without you even knowing it, without you even clicking on anything. That's what Hanan Khashoggi says happened to her, and she says that intel that the Saudis ultimately got off of her phone was instrumental in the murder of her husband back in 2018. It was a very emotional and powerful conversation, I have to say, Hallie.
Tell us more about it. I mean, did she, when she talked about this, I mean, we heard her getting emotional. We heard her and saw her tearing up about this. How is she doing now, so long after her husband's murder?
She's living in fear, Hallie. She told me that she fears that she could be assassinated herself at any time. She's particularly paranoid, she says, about her own cell phones now. She's not sure who's spying on her phone. You know, if they get into your phone, they have the microphone, they can listen, they have the camera, they can watch, they see all your communications, texts, everything you Google online. All of that, you know, is very, very deeply invasive. And she says she lives a life of fear now, but she's trying to move past it. And she's trying with this suit against NSO Group to make sure that nobody else is spied on the way she says that she was spied on. And I can tell you, Hallie, you mentioned that golf deal, which has been in a lot of headlines, Live Golf merging with the PGA. I did ask her her opinion on that. Her answer on that was somewhat surprising to me, and we're going to have that on NBC Nightly News tonight.
Eamon Javers, thank you very much. As he mentioned, you will see more coming up with Lester Holt, wherever you get your local NBC News station, 6:30 Eastern. Obviously, not something you're going to want to miss. Coming up, hundreds of thousands of UPS workers take one step closer to an historic strike. We'll tell you if and when it could happen in the 5 things. Plus, a whole bunch of controversy around this LA Dodgers game tonight. We're going to explain live from the stadium. Stay with us. To a damning new report out of the Justice Department exposing a history of racist, violent, and abusive actions by the Minneapolis Police Department. Its 92-page report from the DOJ concludes a 2+ year-long investigation launched after the murder of George Floyd by ex-Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin in 2020. The findings coming under 4 big categories here. The DOJ says Minneapolis PD repeatedly used excessive force, unlawfully discriminated against Black and Native American people, violated First Amendment rights of protesters and journalists, and violated the American with Disabilities Act when responding to people who had behavioral health disabilities. The Attorney General in Minneapolis being crystal clear about the systemic issues in this department.
The patterns and practices we observed made what happened to George Floyd possible.
The city's mayor and police chief appearing alongside Garland, saying they will follow the DOJ's recommendations. Shaq Brewster joins us now. Scathing only begins to describe what is laid out in the report here, right? So you had the Attorney General walking through some of the specific allegations in very disturbing detail.
Yeah, and that's probably what was the most shocking about this report, just how specific those allegations went, those specific anecdotes that you heard come from the Attorney General. I mean, and we have a graphic of some of them here, but talking about how there was failure to render aid to a diabetic woman who called the police. You have another situation where they used dangerous neck restraints in 44 incidents without an underlying arrest afterwards. They stopped 4 Somali American teens. You heard the Attorney General walk through this story here. here and invoked the Black Hawk Down incident, a deadly incident, while they were interacting with those teens. So you have some really serious allegations here, especially then when you look at the stops and the searches and the discrepancy and disparities there between white citizens of the city and black citizens and Native American citizens. You have a really pretty big picture laid out by the Attorney General, just showing how different people are treated so differently over a long period of time. It's why they have this pattern and practice investigation, Hallie.
You have a particularly unique perspective on this, Shaq, because you were on the ground in Minneapolis after George Floyd's murder. You were there in the days and the weeks covering what happened in the aftermath here. How does what we are hearing from the DOJ today line up with what you have been hearing from the community about the police department as it existed at that time?
It really mirrors what you heard from the community, and it really underscored and explained the level of anger that you had from members of the community in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. You had people who were saying, we have to protest. We're out here despite a pandemic. Remember, months into a pandemic there, they said they were doing that because they felt like this was their opportunity to put a spotlight on what they were going through and what they've been going through for years and years. I'll tell you, some of the rhetoric that you have from folks in the community now, if you look on Twitter, if you look on social media, is almost a "we told you so." We knew this was happening, and I'm glad, in their words, that this is now coming to light from the federal government, Hallie.
Talk about the what's next piece, because we know that the mayor, the current police chief were there alongside Merrick Garland, saying they're going to follow this roadmap, basically, that a judge puts in place. Here's the mayor.
We understand that change is non-negotiable.
Talk through next steps, right? If change is non-negotiable, when's it going to happen?
Yeah, and I should note that we heard from the Attorney General, and in his comments, he credited the city for already moving on some of these reforms. This report actually listed out 28 what they call remedial steps. Essentially, these are recommendations from the Department of Justice to the city of Minneapolis. Things like revising the use of force policies. I'll tell you, that is already being done with a focus on de-escalation in the city of Minneapolis. Improving documentation of police activity. That's how we know how many chokeholds and neck restraints have been used over the past couple of years. Protest-related training, address misuse complaints, and improving that training overall. So there are steps that the Department of Justice will now work with the city to create that so-called consent decree, that court enforceable agreement to say that these recommendations are now going to be monitored and made sure that they are implemented. But in the city of Minneapolis, you're already seeing many of these changes on their way to being implemented, if not fully implemented at this point, Hallie.
Shaq Brewster, thank you for that. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the man who leaked the Pentagon Papers has died at the age of 92. Back in 1969, Daniel Ellsberg was a military analyst who exposed government lies about the Vietnam War to some of the country's top newspapers. That eventually led to an historic First Amendment Supreme Court case. Ellsberg was charged with espionage, theft, and conspiracy before a judge dismissed the case. His family says he died from pancreatic cancer at his home in California. Number 2, UPS workers are one step closer to a strike if they don't get a deal by August 1st. That's not long after the company said it would put AC in delivery trucks, new ones. That was seen as a big step forward in contract talks. If a strike does happen, it would be the biggest single employer strike in American history. Obviously, we're watching how those negotiations go. Number 3, Ja Morant, the NBA's Memphis Grizzlies player, is suspended for 25 games next season after that second video came out of him waving around a gun, appearing to at least, on Instagram. The commissioner called what he did reckless and irresponsible. Morant apologized and said he would spend the offseason working on his mental health. Number 5, check this out. This little village in Switzerland, look how close that rock slide came. Literally feet from, I mean, look, destroying the whole thing, wiping it out, basically. The people who lived there had already been evacuated. They've been gone since mid-May because of concerns about just how unstable this mountainside was. The folks who live there still don't know when they can go home. There's still a bunch of loose rock that's expected to fall. Pretty wild. In just the next couple of hours, Pride Night will start at Dodger Stadium, and it is a night that has been surrounded by controversy, as you've heard about here on this show, because of a group getting honored. Remember, the team invited a self-described group of queer and trans nuns called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence early last month. So that's when the invite goes out. Critics say, hey, they mock Christian customs. A week or so later, there was pushback from some people like Senator Marco Rubio, who's from Florida, who wrote a letter saying that the team wasn't being inclusive. So the Dodgers uninvited the group, but then there was backlash to that. So then they re-invited the group after members of the LGBTQ+ community said that wasn't fair. That brings us to tonight, where there will also be protests by Catholics right around the same time this Pride Night starts. Let's bring in Hallie Charles out there at the stadium. A couple of hours behind me where I am in New York, right? But there will be this kind of split screen tonight. People enjoying Pride Night, people who are against this group, Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Talk us through it.
Yeah, that drag group is set to be honored by the Dodgers here at the stadium tonight, Hallie, for their Pride event. And it's hard to ignore the timing of this protest given the culture wars across the country with religious groups and also right-wing conservatives standing up to what they're calling woke culture. So we do know today near the arena and surrounding there's going to be an increased police presence, and that's because protester organizers tell us that they're expecting thousands of people to come, Hallie, because the Dodgers have acquired national outrage because of their decision to honor this drag group tonight. We are expecting protesters from out of the country. One of the groups heading this, the Catholic group, is hosting this with a Texas bishop that is known to be especially controversial. So another thing here, Hallie, with these two groups being potentially head-to-head is that over the last couple of weeks here in Los Angeles, we've seen violent protests between those two groups with Pride event protests happening at schools. So that's why police are increasing the amount of police presence here. And also another big thing here, Hallie, is the fact that the Dodgers are playing their biggest rival tonight, San Francisco Giants, who are from the so-called gay capital of the world. So you have that. Those games are known to be especially rowdy. And then the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence are also from San Francisco. So there's a lot of potential here, Hallie, hoping it doesn't get to that point. But police say they're ready just in case, but also giving people the freedom to exercise their right to free speech.
It's not like Dodgers Pride Night is new, right? I mean, they've been holding this thing for like 10 years, and there hasn't been this much pushback against it before.
Right, there hasn't been, and I spoke to some of the people here, and the main thing, Hallie, is on top of the fact that they are outraged by this drag group that they say mocks the Catholic faith, they're also offended by that flip-flop that you mentioned, right? So at first, the Dodgers caved. They uninvited the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence to appease the religious groups, but then they flip-flopped and re-invited them after their main sponsor here, the LA Pride, dropped out of the event with other LGBT groups threatening to follow suit and boycott. So they feel that just offended by that. Listen to one of what someone told me about why this game specifically makes them upset.
We did protest, but we never had a large protest. I think what went over the top is when they were giving an award to a group that is so anti-Catholic. This has made me not want to go to Dodger Stadium because I put my faith ahead of my baseball.
The Dodgers aren't the first organization to be in the center of these culture wars, Hallie. Just this week, Target even announced that they've received bomb threats because of Pride merchandise that they're selling, which they've sold for a decade. Hallie?
Hallie Charles live for us there at Dodger Stadium, which, by the way, is set to hold a Christian Faith and Family Day down the road, too. Hallie, thank you very much. When we come back here on the show, we'll go one-on-one live with Miami Mayor and 2024 presidential candidate, officially now, Francis Suarez. That's tonight's newsmaker. Why he thinks he can do what no sitting mayor has ever done and go right to the White House. It's coming up. To tonight's newsmaker now, where we go one-on-one with the people making headlines on the issues we're all talking about. And tonight, that is, of course, the 2024 race to the White House. It just got a little bit bigger in the last 24 hours with the latest Republican candidate jumping into the race. You see him there, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, who says the rest of the country needs to be more like Miami. The mayor joins us now. Hi, Mr. Mayor. Good to be with you. Thank you for joining the show.
It's good to be with you as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
So in the last 24 hours, I've watched a lot of interviews you've done where you've talked about being a unifier. You think you have a role and a position in this race, a lane that nobody else is filling right now. Let me ask you this. No mayor has ever gone on from that position directly to become president. Help people understand why you think you have the qualifications for the position of presidency.
The reason why is because I have a track record of success where I've lowered taxes, which has created tremendous economic growth in my city. I've kept people safe, which is a fundamental right and what people are seeking in American cities, where 85% of the people in America live and 91% of the GDP of this country is produced. And we had the lowest per capita rate, homicide rate since 1964 last year. This year, we're 40% below that number by increasing funding for our police, not decreasing funding for police like we saw across America. And the third thing is I've leaned into this opportunity, this generational opportunity of prosperity by leaning into what is an inflection point, in my opinion, from the industrial economy to the increasingly digital economy. We positioned our city, and we need to position our country, frankly, for that moment. And I don't think the candidates are really talking about that. And I'm not sure how many of them actually understand how to position our country for the maximum amount of prosperity. That's what I want to focus on. I want to focus on the things that we can agree on, which is safety and security for all of our citizens, prosperity for ourselves and our children, and trying to seek tomorrows that are better than our yesterdays. We spend 80% of the time arguing over the 20% of things that we don't agree on.
I hear you framing sort of this new generation argument for yourself. There is somebody else in this race, and we showed that big board of people, who is also trying to position himself as part of the new generation, and that is somebody you know, your state's governor, who has really dug in on this fight with Florida's biggest employer, Disney, or one of the biggest tourism attractions, of course, in the state. Is Governor DeSantis wrong to try to do battle with Disney, in your view?
I think he's wrong. You know, when he began this fight, I think he had a good argument, which was that, you know, we don't necessarily want the school system or government generally telling parents, you know, how to teach their small children, you know, a K through third grade sexuality. I think that's a winning argument. I think he should have stopped there and not made it personal. I think the fact that he made it personal by threatening to, for example, put a jail next to Disney, by saying that he was going to repeal Disney's tax exempt status. Now what you do is you're two C-suite executives that are going at it, and it costs, you know, first of all, it costs his state potentially thousands of jobs, billions of dollars of investment, and then you have 80,000 employees in your state that are worried. Are they going to have a job? Are they going to have a place to work? Many of them work paycheck to paycheck. So, you know, you can't convert political battles into personal battles. And I think the problem here is that, like our current president, you know, our current governor hasn't spent that much time in the private sector, and maybe doesn't have such a tether to the private sector, understand how the private sector works.
You alluded to what the foundation of that sort of initial feud, if you will, was, and that was this back and forth over the governor's so-called Don't Say Gay law, which, as you know, has made headlines around the country. You've done things like sign an ordinance recognizing LGBTQ plus people's contributions to Miami. You have publicly previously pledged your support for Pride Month. So let me ask you this. Do you support the expansion of the Don't Say Gay law to all grades? That is a question on the table in your state.
Yeah, I think that's excessive. I think we need to make sure that, you know, young adults do get sex education training. I do think it shouldn't be indoctrination, and I think that's where the debate is. I think it should be, you know, sex education training, because we need to make sure that our children can grow up in an environment where they can make good choices. But I don't think it should be indoctrination, and I think that's where there can be a debate. But listen, Miami's a very inclusive city. We're a city that is very tolerant. We want everyone to feel comfortable and confident being in our city, and it's something, that diversity of our city is a strength for us.
The Miami Herald reports you're under investigation for allegations of taking payments from a developer to help fast-track this big, expensive real estate project. You've been asked about this. I know you have denied wrongdoing. So can you clearly explain why you were paid $10,000 a month from that developer's subsidiary?
Sure. I was paid to help them raise capital, which is something that I've been very clear about from day one. That's the job that I do. It has nothing to do with my role as mayor of the city of Miami. I've been a public official for 13 years. I've been a working public official the entire time. I've never had an ethics issue. I've never had a scandal in my entirety of my career. And a couple of weeks before, it just so happens that the Miami Herald does this targeted hit job on me to try to discredit me before I run for president. And the reason why is because I am the biggest threat to the Democratic Party. I'm a young, Hispanic, conservative from a big city. And that is the kryptonite to the Democrats, because, of course, they would love it nothing more than not to lose Hispanics, which are losing because they call them Latinx, and say that they're as unique as San Antonio tacos. They don't want to lose young voters because they won young voters by 26 points in the last presidential election. And, of course, they want to make sure that they don't lose things like suburban women.
I hear you say that, obviously, you feel that your ethics record is important to you. I assume transparency is as well?
Of course,
so
absolutely. It is incredibly important.
Will you commit to disclosing your client list?
You know, I'll commit to doing what all the presidential candidates do, which is to transparently showing my tax returns, which I believe will show pretty much everyone who pays me. So I think that is the equivalency, yes.
Okay, well, let me just, because there is a level of scrutiny that comes, as you know, with running for president that is different for, you know, other levels of government here. Is that then, yes, you will commit to disclosing your list of clients who you work for outside of your role as mayor?
Well, I'll tell you this. The federal disclosures are extremely comprehensive. Any income that is over $5,000 of gross income has to be disclosed. So it basically discloses any single source of income. Right. So, yes, I have a federal obligation, just like every candidate does, to disclose every single source of income over what is a very, very small threshold of $5,000.
I hear you.
So, yes,
as you well know, Donald Trump never disclosed his taxes. So it's a question. I appreciate you answering it, that you will do that. So that's, you know, news. I have two more quick questions for you. One, I know you've taken a lot of questions on former President Trump. I know that. But my question for you is about, you obviously sort of now famously say that you didn't support him, you didn't vote for him in either of the last two elections, but you do say that you would back him now as your party's nominee if he ends up as the nominee. That is an about face. Is that about face now about getting on the debate stage in August?
No, it's not an about face. It's about it is about a worry of Joe Biden's America, and I've been very clear about this. Joe Biden's America is an America that I am worried for my children to grow up. It's an America where the poor are getting poorer through increased interest rates and inflation. It's an America that is getting weaker in the world through a posture of weakness. We are inviting aggression from our enemies, and it is an America where, in my lifetime, it's possible that China may have a greater GDP than us and may become the lone superpower. That is not the kind of country that I want to see. And what I've seen in the last 2 years frightens me to no end as a parent. And that's the reason why I said that I would support the former president if he were the nominee against Joe Biden. But of course, I'm running to be the nominee. That's why there is some level of frustration sometimes when I want to change the conversation to talking about my candidacy for presidency.
Before I let you go on that topic, your candidacy for president, I get it. You are running for president here, but I have to ask, because your name has been floated for this, would you consider perhaps taking on a vice presidential nomination if somebody offers it?
You know, it is a little ironic on the second day of my candidacy for president to be asked that question. But I will say,
Kellyanne Conway has floated your name. That is not a surprise to you. She has said you should be on a short list for a VP nomination for Donald Trump. Would you accept something like that?
Listen, it's not the first time that someone has suggested me to be a VP for one of the candidates. I think it's obviously flattering to be considered at that level. But the truth is that I'm running for president because I think I'm different. I think I'm unique, and I think I have something special to offer the American people. And I think I can inspire them to choose me over the other options.
Mayor Francis Suarez of Miami. Mr. Mayor, thank you for being on the show. I am sure we'll talk again in the weeks and months to come. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up here on the show, new warnings tonight about a popular product that helps babies sleep, some say. Why a group of doctors now say these weighted sleep sacks could be dangerous. We've got an NBC News exclusive next. The country's biggest group of pediatricians warning a product that is designed to help babies sleep better could be dangerous. In an NBC News exclusive, the American Academy of Pediatrics says putting babies in those weighted swaddles or sleep sacks could hypothetically increase the risk of SIDS by making it harder for babies to react if they don't have enough oxygen. We're talking about products like these, for example, from Dreamland Baby, which makes some of the best-known weighted sleep sacks, along with Nested Bean. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has not put out any warnings about infant deaths linked to these kinds of products, but the agency's chair says it is taking a close look at them as part of a bigger examination. Nested Bean's founder tells NBC News there's no evidence the company's products are dangerous. Another company that makes them, Dreamland, says its founder says the company has not heard any concerns about babies having difficulty breathing from customers. Dr. Natalie Azar joins me now. And Dr. Natalie, this was, let me just tell you, in parent circles, especially in those newborn days, it is all about sleep sacks. Which sleep sacks work? Should you use the weighted ones? Does it help the baby sleep? So the idea that there is now a warning from this group of pediatricians can be concerning. How should people be thinking about this?
It is concerning. I reached out to a couple of colleagues of mine just to say, have you ever recommended these? And, the bottom line on this is that the concern has to do with, you're using it in these newborns and the first couple of months, and you and I have talked about our kids a lot on the show before, it is incredibly challenging to get them to sleep. And what infants have, and what they have until they're about 3 to 4 months old, is something called a startle reflex, which means that in the middle of the night while they're sleeping, they could suddenly awaken themselves with this reflex. And the weighted blanket is meant to, inhibit that. But the experts are saying, and the reason why they're saying this is that arousal, that reflex to wake up is normal. And if you are inhibiting that with these weighted blankets, you are theoretically increasing the child's risk of SIDS. And they're basing this on a study that was actually commissioned by one of the manufacturers of these weighted blankets that showed that there was some desaturation, meaning the oxygen saturation did go down a little bit, not to dangerous levels, and heart rate did go up a little bit, again, not to dangerous levels, when babies had these weighted things on for about 2 minutes. So the concern here, Hallie, is that, well, what happens if you're doing this for many, many hours in a night? And it is true, there is no strong evidence right now, meaning not multiple reports that kids have died because of this, but pediatricians are saying we don't want to wait
for
that
their whole
to happen
point is
before
like,
we say we need to pull the...
Yeah, their whole point is we don't want to
exactly
get to that point at this point. Listen, Nested Bean had done its own, because the advertising around some of this, right, the marketing is to say that it is safe, right? I mean, these companies understand that. They commissioned a study on their products. But as our reporting shows, the issue that doctors had, according to our team that did this, including Susie Kim, was that it didn't actually say safe or dangerous, right, as you've explained, this whole 2-minute test window here. What is the takeaway, Dr. Natalie, right? Like, in other words, full disclosure, I had a weighted sleep sack for my child, right? Many of my friends did. Should those be going into the trash bin? Like, I don't know if we can have a takeaway here, but what would you tell your patients?
The number one thing I would say, Hallie, is ask your pediatrician, because it's very likely that they're going to fall in line with what the AAP is saying. And this pediatrician that I spoke to said, maybe a handful of times she recommended it over the years in certain cases. But generally speaking, no. I mean, what can you do? Swaddling still works. Swaddling kind of like pulls their limbs in and can sort of inhibit that. But the important thing is for parents to understand that reflex happens naturally, again, for about 3 to 4 months. But at around 4 months, kids can start rolling over. And that's when it becomes a big issue. So it is a small window of time. But if I've said to, my friend said to me, but when I was having kids, and I say to my patients and to friends, it's a couple months. It's a hard couple of months, but eventually by the time they get to that 4-month mark, they're sleeping through the night. It's probably just not worth the risk. But always, always, always ask your pediatrician first, Hallie. I think they're going to give you the right guidance.
Dr. Natalie Azar, it's always good to have you on. Thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. Out of our Northeast Bureau, more problems for I-95 near Philly. So the detour for the part of 95 that collapsed had to get its own detour today because it looks like a truck clipped some power lines. A pole came crashing down onto this car you see here. Luckily, nobody inside was hurt, but it took crews a few hours to clean up the mess. Boy, what a headache up there. Out of our Western Bureau, the Coast Guard says it rescued Dory, this German Shepherd, after the dog fell off a cliff in Oregon, like 300 feet, right onto this kind of secluded beach. Look at her. She was hurt, so they got out of a helicopter and swam to reach her. Fortunately, Dory is in stable condition, and she has been reunited with her owner. Some good news tonight. And out of our Southern Bureau, the Charlotte Hornets say Michael Jordan is selling his majority ownership of the team to an investment group. A source close to the deal tells CNBC he sold his stake for $3 billion. He'll keep minority ownership. Jordan's reps did not immediately respond to additional requests for comment from NBC News, but the end of the Jordan era for the Hornets. That does it for us for this hour. If you missed any of it, catch up on the latest reporting and newest interviews from our team. You can find us anytime in so many places, including Peacock, Hulu, YouTube. Just search Hallie Jackson now, and you will see it. It's been lovely to be with you from here at our 30 Rockefeller Plaza studio. I will see you back home in Washington on Monday. 5 p.m. Eastern. Have a great weekend. We'll see you then. Take care.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.